I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting this morning, the Kaurna people, and also the traditional owners of the land where I live and work in Bendigo, the Dja Dja Wurrung people. It's a tremendous privilege to be here with you today. I've learnt so much already from other speakers and from talking to all of you. So, what are we going to do in the next hour or so that we've got together? We're going to talk about expressive and receptive language skills being the foundations of early reading achievement and how to maximise success for all. In the time that we've got together, I'm going to touch on oral language, what it is and why it's important, but I also want to get you to think, and this might sound odd coming from me, I want you to think about the limits of oral language when it comes to children learning how to read. Because oral language isn't everything. It's important, but it's not everything. And we'll take a bit of a deeper dive on language skills and how they support early literacy. I also want to spend a bit of time talking about cognitive load theory, which some of you may have heard about, but not all of you, and I think it's an incredibly useful tool in your toolkit. I talked yesterday about socioeconomic status and early language exposure. I'm not going to go back over that territory, but it's important to remember and to know that there is a social gradient with respect to what children experience in the preschool years, and it would be nice if they all came in at the same amazing starting point, but they don't. And so rather than being nihilistic and saying, oh, well, what can we do here? The answer to that is we have to do a lot around explicit instruction to bring those children who are starting from behind up to the starting point of the more advantaged children, and in order to do that we have to accelerate their progress. So we actually have to be doing things that have them moving faster than the more able students are when they arrive at school, and I think that's quite an enormous challenge. We can't have them moving at the same speed as the other children because the other children are going to keep moving and probably going to take off and gain some momentum. And of course it's important to be thinking about the big five. I know in South Australia the big six. I'm going to provoke you to think about the big seven and include morphology, so we can potentially keep this going and going. So of course that's an important background framework. I'm going to touch a little bit on the role of evidence in informing educational practices. This is a little bit of a soapbox of mine that I think education could do a lot better in being more rigorous around how it uses evidence, scientific evidence. I think there's definite progress being made in that direction, which is fantastic. And then I want to do a little bit of myth busting. My key messages: reading, writing and spelling, and of course numeracy, it's just that happens to not be my area of expertise, are 21st century skills for education, for vocational training, for life chances, for quality of life. Employers know this. So don't get swept up in new wave, new age, crystals and beads talk of 21st century skills. This stuff is not going away. It is important and remains important and will remain important, particularly in an economy in which jobs for unskilled workers are disappearing as they are in ours. The cognitive psychology research tells us that a small proportion of children should struggle with reading, writing and spelling, and yet in reality it's 30%, 40%, even higher in some communities. So that tells us provocatively and helpfully that there's something different that we need to be doing in the classroom to change that statistic, because from a cognitive science perspective the number of children who actually have a biological reason for struggling with reading is very small. We suffer more from a research translation failure than we do from a lack of research on what constitutes effective instruction. So we've got oodles and oodles of really good research that tells us how to best get most children across the bridge to literacy. It just so happens that in teacher pre-service education for the last 30 years, that's not been a focus of what we've been giving to pre-service teachers. And pre-service teachers have had to have their own epiphanies and find this stuff out for themselves, sometimes after years and years of practice. So this is because ideology has trumped rigorous evidence for too long in education, together with a willingness to adopt populist fads with little or no robust research to back them. And of course the children who start from behind, which I would suggest in most cases are the children who motivate you to be here and to want to improve your practice, although there are many schools from higher SES schools where teachers feel that they're cruising. So it's a problem that applies at both ends of the spectrum, but it particularly applies to children who start from behind and are coming from a more disadvantaged background, because ironically they're the ones who derive a disproportionate degree of benefit from more explicit instruction delivered by more knowledgeable teachers. So the uplift for those children is considerably greater. In brief, this is a house analogy for thinking about the relationship between language and literacy. And the idea that I'd like you to think about here is that if you're building a house, you don't start with the walls, you certainly don't start with the roof. You probably begin with the foundations, but before you put the foundations down, you've got to think about the ground that you're putting that house on, because if you're putting it on reclaimed land, for example, the foundations would potentially sink. Now, we don't have time today, and I wish I did have time to go into some of these issues down here around social and emotional contexts for language use in the preschool years, because those things are profoundly important. For example, for emotional self-regulation and learning the words of emotional attunement, learning the words of empathy. But this big slab of granite here basically represents the first 5 years, the preschool years, all that goes on expressively and receptively around early oral language skills. But that's not enough to get us right up to the roof. We've got to have these walls that are in a brick pattern, so they're continuing to evolve all the way through childhood and adolescence. The wall on one side is the development of pro-social interpersonal skills, and you can see all the factors that are needed to get that wall building up strongly over time. And the wall on the other side of the house is the transition to literacy. So oral language competence is the thing that drives both of these, but they need specific inputs along the way from key adults such as parents and teachers. Now, if we get the walls in place, then and only then can we begin to think about the roof on the house, which of course is academic achievement, social engagement, marketable employment skills, and transition to further education, training. That's been blocked off. And remember, as I said before, we live in a first world industrialised economy in which jobs for unskilled workers are disappearing, and jobs for unskilled males are disappearing at an increasingly rapid rate, at a particularly rapid rate. Now, if you don't believe that jobs for unskilled workers are disappearing, think about your local supermarket and those horrible self-checkout points. Aren't supermarkets clever? They get you to buy their goods and do their work. How smart is that? What a great business model. But think about the jobs that those self-checkout points take away. They take away unskilled jobs and they replace them with highly skilled jobs. You have to go to university to be the person who designs the IT, installs the equipment and maintains it. So it's a great example of unskilled jobs being replaced, a large number of unskilled jobs being replaced with a smaller number of skilled jobs. We cannot afford to be exiting young people from school who don't have the capacity to be part of a knowledge economy. And you have to have literacy and numeracy skills to be part of a knowledge economy. Thinking about spoken communication, and I know there are some speechies in the room here, but it's important to think about what sits under that umbrella of spoken communication. And again, if we had more time today, we could talk more specifically about speech and how that's different from language, but how it overlaps with language, voice, fluency, and pragmatic language ability. But we also know, as we discussed yesterday, that language consists of many component parts. It's got a form part, which is the phonological system, the syntactic system, and the morphology system, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. It's got the content part, or semantics, which basically means vocabulary, and then there's the knowledge of how to use language in everyday situations and contexts, which is the use part, or sometimes referred to as pragmatic language. Now, this is a model that was published over 40 years ago and is still current today in how we think about the components of language. So it very much informs the thinking of speech pathologists when they're thinking about children and adults who have some kind of communication or language impairment. This is a very helpful framework both for typical development and for understanding difficulties. Now, this is a model that I published a couple of years ago with my colleague Jacinta Douglas, where we were thinking about what does it mean to be a pragmatically competent speaker? What goes into this if you attain that point of pragmatic competence, of people basically not being concerned about the way you use language in everyday contexts? What goes into that? Well, we know this is important. You've got to have core language skills around phonology, syntax, morphology, and vocabulary. That's a given. You need executive functions. You need to be able to pay attention, to plan and organise and so forth. You need social cognition functions. You need to be able to read the play socially and know what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, when to interrupt, how to change topics and so forth. Then we've got the individual characteristics of the child or the person, and then we've got all the social context. So there's a lot going on here when we think about pragmatic language competence. They're relevant to everyday spoken language, if you think about the right-hand wall of our house, but they're also relevant to understanding written language, because spoken language and written language are not one and the same, but they're obviously closely related to each other. Language entails both a surface level of meaning and a deep or non-literal level of meaning. And every day, all of us use a lot of these linguistic devices to make our interactions with each other more interesting, but they also make them more complex for people who don't have well-developed language skills, or who may have a language disorder, or may come from a non-English speaking background. But even if you travel to another English-speaking country, you'll find one of the big points of differentiation, apart from accent, is actually the use of idioms. And every time I go to somewhere like the United States, I say something and people look at me and I realise, you haven't heard that expression, have you? That doesn't mean anything to you at all. So we need to have a good understanding that these linguistic devices, whilst they make our everyday interactions and our written text more interesting, they also make it more opaque for people who don't have a well-developed mastery of idiomatic language. Developmentally, language keeps company with a whole raft of other factors that are developmentally important: thinking, feeling, reasoning, problem-solving, predicting, remembering, perspective-taking, moving from the concrete to the abstract, metacognition, thinking about thinking, and meta-language, talking about language. So language doesn't develop in isolation, it develops in the context of all of these other factors, and those of you particularly in the preschool and early years space will see examples of this every day in your work. So language is something of a paradox in the sense that it's that special facility that we as humans have developed that sets us apart from our closest primate relatives. So it's an innate part of being a human being. But, and it's a big but, it's also vulnerable to a range of developmental conditions, some of which you can see listed here on this slide. So it doesn't take much developmentally to bump language. So it's innate, it's biologically primary, but it's also a bit of a delicate flower because it doesn't take much to harm it. And it's also very sensitive to genetic factors and to environmental exposure. And we talked yesterday about that 30 million word gap in children from more advantaged backgrounds versus children from lower SES family backgrounds in terms of what they experience in the preschool years. So language is not a set and forget function. We know that oral language skills are biologically natural or biologically primary. It's another way of saying the same thing. We know that there's a social gradient that impacts on children's expressive and receptive oral language skills. And I will say that it's very important when we're talking about language to remember that it's a two-channel process. We're not just thinking about the children's expressive language abilities, we also have to be concerned about their receptive language skills, their ability to take in, to understand, to process the language that other people are using with them. And it can be easy to overestimate children's receptive language skills in social contexts because they can read the play and see what other children are doing and generally kind of follow along. But when we take them aside and administer an actual formal measure of receptive language, sometimes it can be quite a confronting surprise to find out how little they can do on their own. Children acquire vocabulary, syntax and discourse skills through repeated exposure and practice in the context of adult, child and peer interactions. There's a feedback loop between oral language skills and reading abilities, and we'll talk a bit more about that. And oral language skills on their own will not turn a talker into a reader. That's a really important take-home message. And I know it might sound like heresy for me as a speechy to be getting up there and almost downplaying the importance of oral language skills. Believe me, that's not the take-home message. But we can't put all of our money on oral language skills if we're wanting children to learn how to read. We've got to put some of our money on oral language skills and some of our money on really good explicit instruction delivered by very knowledgeable teachers about how language works under the bonnet, which is what we're going to get to. So typically when we think about oral language abilities and reading, we think about the top arrow. We think about the fact that oral language abilities are important for and promote early reading abilities, but I'm really going to invite you to think about the bottom arrow and the effect of having good early reading skills on oral language abilities, because we know that the children who do get across that bridge in the first 3 years of school from talking and listening on this side to reading, writing and spelling on the other side, you would have heard me yesterday refer to the Matthew effect, the idea that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. So those children just take off and through their own reading are exposed to more and more vocabulary, to tier 2 vocabulary that doesn't get used so much in conversations, and they're also exposed to more complex sentence structure. So everyday conversation, because of the load on our working memory, tends to be simpler and shorter. We don't tend to use long, elaborate, syntactically complex sentences like I'm doing right now in conversation because it puts too much load on the listener. And the big clue, of course, that children are learning new words exclusively through their reading, and some of you may have experienced this yourself, is that they drop these words into conversation and they mispronounce them because they've never actually heard them said, they've only read them. My little party trick here is to say they put the emphasis on the wrong syllable. And that makes the adults do a double take and then sometimes talk about the word, and that further, of course, consolidates the words. So the rich get richer and the poor get poorer in lots of ways in this game, and we should never underestimate the importance of actual reading abilities for preschool children in developing their oral language skills. So children's own reading is in fact the single biggest source of new vocabulary once they've got over that bridge. Are there limits to what oral language offers with respect to early reading? Hopefully I've already answered this question. Yes. Language skills are critical to learning how to read, but in themselves are not enough because reading is biologically unnatural. Unfortunately, a big part of the thinking in whole language terms about reading was that it was as natural as talking and listening, and that just has not been backed up by the science. So oral language is biologically primary. Reading is a social and human contrivance. It's something that we've actually only been doing for about 5,000 or 6,000 years. That's not been long enough for the human brain to evolve new pathways. The human brain piggybacks reading and writing on oral language neural networks. It's a biologically secondary activity. Everybody needs to be taught how to read. It just so happens that some children need a lot more teaching than others. Some are very fortunate and get by without a lot of explicit instruction, but that's not who we need to be pitching our entire education system to. If we do, then we're going to have a lot of instructional casualties. And yesterday I used the analogy of oral language skills being the engine and high quality instruction being the fuel in the tank. So we need to think both about the quality of the engine and the nature of the fuel that we're putting in the tank. So there are things that we can control and things we can't control as education practitioners. Not all children arrive at school with high quality, highly developed oral language skills, but all children should be exposed to high quality instruction delivered by highly knowledgeable teachers. That's the bit that we as the grown-ups do get to control. We can't control what goes on in the first 5 years of life. There have been lots of efforts to impact on that. Programs like Head Start in the US, Sure Start in the UK, millions and millions and millions of dollars have been spent trying to impact the lives of, if you like, disadvantaged low SES families, and that hasn't really worked. I say we put our investment in the space where we can have an impact, which is in actual classrooms once children get to school. So let's lift the bonnet on oral language and its links with literacy. There are lots of things, lots of concepts that it's worth you knowing more about in the early teaching of literacy. I won't spend a lot of time talking about these things, but I would recommend that you run your eye down this list and do a bit of a self-check. Ask yourself how many of those concepts you could actually explain to a novice. So if you had a student teacher with you tomorrow who didn't know what a phoneme is or what phonemic awareness is or how phonemic awareness differs from phonological awareness, if you can't explain it to someone else, that suggests that you don't have a deep understanding of it. You might have an implicit understanding, but not an explicit understanding. Graphemes, letters, combinations of letters that represent phonemes, which are speech sounds, recognisable speech sounds in a given language. So the phonemes in English will be different from the phonemes in Thai, for example. Morphemes, we're going to talk a little bit more about morphemes and morphology, the smallest units of meaning within a word. So that relates to the idea of sublexical analysis below the level of the word. Orthography, the prefix ortho means right, so hence we get words like orthodox, right God, orthopedic, writing bones. Orthography means correct writing system, so every language has its own orthography. English does not, don't let anyone tell you English has a dense orthography. English has a semi-transparent orthography because of the fact that we've stolen so many words from so many different languages. But English is a much more transparent orthography than many people make it out to be. It's a rule-governed orthography. It just so happens that there's quite a few rules, but it is a rule-governed orthography. Etymology is the study of word origins. It's not the study of insects, that's entomology. Letters are different from sounds, and letters don't make sounds. If you want to test that hypothesis, pick up a piece of paper and hold it up to your ears. If you can't hear anything, that's confirming that letters don't make sounds, okay? Letters represent sounds. More specifically, graphemes, single letters and combinations of letters, represent phonemes. That's a much more sophisticated way of thinking about that relationship. You need to know about consonants, vowels, long and short, syllables, stressed and unstressed, and the schwa vowel. Now, I'm tempted to ask for a show of hands, and I sometimes do this when I run Teacher PD about who's ever heard of the schwa vowel, and it's usually a relatively small number of hands that go up. Would that be the case if I were to hypothetically do that here? And that's not your fault. It's because you weren't taught it in your pre-service education. So that the schwa vowel is the unstressed vowel in a polysyllabic word. So if you take my name, Pamela, the vowels are not equally stressed. What's the unstressed vowel or the unstressed syllable in Pamela? The first one, the second one, or the third one? The second one. Now, and you know that because it has an sound. That's the schwa vowel. There you go, you've all learnt something today. And it's really helpful to know about the schwa vowel because it behaves differently in the context of different words when it's representing the unstressed syllable. And I've seen teachers talking to 5-year-olds about schwa vowels, and I've seen classes of prep children, foundation, reception children identifying and discussing schwa vowels. Digraphs, when we've got 2 letters representing one sound, trigraphs, 3 letters representing one sound, split digraphs, as in words like make, for example, where the A and the E are working together to make one digraph. Diphthongs, it's always a fun one to spell, that one, and spell checker never seems to help you. So that's where we have 2 vowel sounds consecutively, and they occur quite commonly in English. Words like boy, oi. Just stretch it out a little bit and you can hear that there's two vowel sounds there, oi. Bay, A. 2 vowel sounds there. Helpful to know about diphthongs. Homophones and homographs. Homophones spelt differently and sound the same, and the other way around for homographs. And then, of course, it's helpful to have a really big think about the role of sight words, whether you call them sight words, high-frequency words, or irregular words, and how to teach them. Ultimately, we want every word to become a sight word. The purpose of teaching reading and becoming a proficient, fluent reader, of course, is to have that level of automaticity. I challenge you to read the words, to look at the words on that slide and not read them. You cannot do that because reading for you is so highly automatised. And if you think about the Scarborough reading rope, by the time you get to the right-hand side of the reading rope, we're talking about the expert reader, where everything is highly automatised. When you look at the start of the Scarborough reading rope, you're looking at individual threads that the novice is very conscious of and having to work on individually. So it's very important, as people who are expert readers, to take the stance of the novice and to understand all the individual threads that the novice is trying to juggle simultaneously. So just sticking with these tricky PH terms, there's way too many terms that start with PH in this space. That's a very bad design feature of linguistics. So it's important to understand phonological awareness, and those of you who work in the preschool space, of course, will be all over this, that this is where we're talking about differentiating speech from non-speech, rhyme, syllabification, alliteration. Phonemic awareness is actually a subset of phonological awareness, so they're not two things that sit at the same level. One sits below the other. Phonemic awareness is a subset of phonological awareness. Phonemes are single speech sounds, and they're represented by graphemes, one or more letters, and that, of course, leads us into the notion of blending, segmenting, deleting, and adding sounds as practice activities. Now, notice there that there's an ing here, so the important thing here is to be teaching the process of blending, not teaching blends. Children don't need to learn blends if they're learning the lower order skill of blending, because then they can deal with any blend when they encounter it. So you're wasting cognitive space, working memory, you're wasting mental RAM by teaching blends. Teach blending, and then children can deal with anything that they encounter. Segmenting is incredibly important for the process of spelling. So they're like bookends to each other. And deleting and adding, of course, augment both. They augment both reading and spelling. Now, sometimes I hear people mixing up phonics and phonetics. So just a passing reference here to the fact that phonetics is actually a branch of linguistics. And I'd be really disappointed to hear anyone say that they're teaching children to read using phonetics or teaching phonetically. I really hope you're not teaching phonetically, because someone's going to have to do a lot of unteaching of what you've taught those children. Phonics, if you're in any doubt, is about the relationship between sounds and letters, phonemes and graphemes, and it must involve having your eyes open. If a child's eyes are not open, you're not doing phonics, because you're not explicitly linking phonemes, what we can hear, with graphemes, what you can see on the page. Phonetics, as I said, is a branch of linguistics. So if we take someone's name, Phyllis James, phonetic, you'd be familiar with looking in the dictionary and seeing funny squiggles next to a word. That's the International Phonetic Alphabet that tells you how that word is pronounced. So if you know the International Phonetic Alphabet, you know how to pronounce that word. And this is what we might come up with, or what a child might come up with in terms of invented spelling when they're trying to write phonetically. So just to make that distinction for you. Now let's do that deep dive a little bit under the bonnet about the components of language. Vocabulary, and here I'm sure I'm not telling you an awful lot that you don't already know, but it might make some of your implicit knowledge a little bit more explicit. Vocabulary, of course, refers to the words that we know. It refers to our mental lexicon, what we've got stored inside our head in terms of words. It's acquired both incidentally through interactions between adults and children and between children, and via explicit instruction. It's acquired through repeated contextualised exposure. And kids don't like being drilled on vocabulary too much because it's actually helpful for them to learn it in context, which goes back to that important point about children's own reading. There's no better way to be learning new vocabulary than not even noticing that you're learning it because you're so immersed in the meaning of what you're reading and so enthralled by what you're reading. A stronger vocabulary allows more nuancing around shades of meaning and enables the processing and production of more complex ideas. So the more nuanced your vocabulary is, the more shades of meaning that you can deal with, both in conversation and in relation to the inferencing that you need to do when you're reading. And I'll show you an example of that in a moment. Vocabulary knowledge supports the acquisition of content knowledge. So if you're going to be studying biology, there's a whole lot of tier 2 and maybe tier 3 vocabulary that you need to acquire in order to grasp the content space. We know that vocabulary, of course, reflects sociolinguistic influences. So here we might be looking at the impact of subculture. We might be looking at ethnic differences. If you go to America, Black American English is very different from standard American English. It's a legitimate dialect, but it happens to be very different. So sociolinguistic influences on vocabulary are very important. It needs to develop across all parts of speech, not just nouns. So, adjectives, adverbs, prepositions, the whole lot, not just building up a bank of nouns. And of course it moves us into abstraction, meta-language, the ability to talk about language, to draw inferences. I'm a much bigger fan of the term inferencing than I am of predicting. When we ask children, particularly novices, to predict, we're asking them to go into the abyss. We're asking them to take a jump to the unknown. When we're asking them to inference, we're asking them to work with what they've already got and make a hypothesis rather than a wild guess. So inferencing, dealing with ambiguity, and these things of course become more important as text complexity increases across the school years, which we all know that it does. So let's have a look at an example of shades of meaning. Here we've got poor Dave, who's not had a good day. He was either deeply angered by the letter from his boss or deeply humiliated by the letter from his boss, deeply aggrieved, deeply annoyed, deeply aggravated, or deeply embarrassed. Now, you're talking to Dave and you've got to respond to him. He's quite emotionally activated. Now, if he is humiliated, how is that going to inform your response versus if he was angered? What are you going to do and what are you going to say to Dave to help him out if he feels humiliated? What's your approach going to be there versus if he's angry? Or you can take it the other way around. If he's angry, how is that? Well, let's just start with anger. If he's angry, what are you going to do? Try and calm him down, let him vent, maybe. Your aim here is going to be to down-regulate, isn't it? Because that heightened emotional state. Now, what about if he's humiliated? Are you trying to down-regulate if he's humiliated? No, you're going to be trying to provide support, aren't you? But it's your nuanced language of vocabulary here and, of course, of somebody else's emotional state that helps you fine-tune your response. And he might tell you that he feels aggrieved. And because you know that aggrieved is different from embarrassed, that's going to inform the way that you respond. So this is really important in terms of everyday interpersonal success. It's also incredibly important for reading success. Now, syntax, of course, refers to sentence structure and sentence complexity. Syntax is the system of rules that determine how we put words together in a particular order to express meaning. Words are not coming out of my mouth at the moment in a random order, and if they were, you would find that very discombobulating because you don't want to have to unscramble them and put them back into the right order in your head in real time. You can't do that. So here we're talking about being able to construct and understand increasingly complex sentences because that's critical to being able to engage in more complex discourse genres in oral and written language. And syntax probably really comes into its own, particularly in written language, which is so important academically, because we have to, over time, express increasingly complex ideas in written text. So we use syntax, for example, to express cause and effect. Jake stayed home from school because he felt sick. So we've got two separate ideas, staying home from school and feeling sick. A very young child will express those as separate ideas. Once children learn about subordinating and coordinating conjunctions, they turn them into one sentence and use because. Jake pretended to be sick so he could stay home from school. Again, two ideas linked with a coordinating conjunction. Temporal relationships. I went to the post office after I had been to the supermarket. So not I went to the post office, I went to the supermarket. We're linking those ideas temporally by using the word after. Agent-action relationships. The umpire was abused by the player. That's passive voice. The player abused the umpire. Active voice. And of course, relative clauses. The man who was running for captain was my dad. So there's quite a few ideas embedded in there, which is why we call that an embedded sentence. So syntax is incredibly important for representing more complex ideas. And then we move into morphology. And I think morphology has been out in the cold for too long in this space. I think phonics has had a really tricky passage and been the ugly duckling and is starting to turn into the beautiful swan that we all know that it is. But I think we also need to look at embracing morphology. And here we're talking, as I said earlier, about sublexical knowledge. Sometimes this is referred to as structured word inquiry or guided word inquiry. But we're going below the level of the word. Now, this is important because English is a morphophonemic language. English words are made up of morphemes, roots, and then inflections that we add, prefixes and suffixes, and phonemes. That just happens to be the structure of the English language. Phonology, the sound system, phonemic awareness, phoneme-grapheme correspondences, and phonics knowledge are all relevant, and I would say must precede study of morphology. It doesn't make sense to start with morphology. That's starting too far up the ladder. It makes sense to start with phoneme-grapheme correspondences and then build up to talking about morphology. Under good circumstances, this is a terrific thing to start doing around grade 3, grade 4. Some teachers might start to do it earlier with children who are doing very well in the first 3 years of school, but certainly around grade 3, grade 4, you should be thinking about bringing in very explicit instruction and discussion about morphology. So a morpheme is the smallest unit of meaning within a word, and here we're talking about root words and then affixes, which are prefixes and suffixes. There's a large number of prefixes and suffixes in English, but there's a relatively constrained number that occur most often, and they're the ones that are most useful to know about. Some morphemes are bound, which means that they can exist on their own, like arm, and then it can have another morpheme attached to it, like armchair, and some that's unbound, and some are bound, like the ones that you can see here. So we don't have the word pre. Pre is not a word, it's a prefix, ironically. Dis is not a word, it's a prefix, so it doesn't exist on its own. So that's a bound morpheme. It has to be bound to a root word. Etymology, as I said earlier, is the study of word origins, which is a tremendously useful science to introduce to children in the primary schools around reading and spelling. Morphology is highly relevant to the learning of spelling rules and patterns. Now, if we have a look at this little sample down the bottom here, this child has written, "I watched the footy," and they've written watch, W-A-T-C-H-T. Now, what can you derive from that child's writing? What's that child's little sample of writing telling us? What can they do? What are they doing well? Even when we look at this error, it's telling us something that they are doing. They can actually hear, because even though it's ED, it doesn't actually necessarily have a D sound, particularly when the phoneme before it is voiceless, which ch is, as opposed to j, which is the voiced version, and this is where that knowledge below the bonnet really helps. And this is about phonetic environment. So an unvoiced consonant is typically followed, because it's easier for us as speakers to make it unvoiced what happens next. So the ED is pronounced as a T. I watched the footy. So say it out loud to yourself if you don't believe me. It's not actually pronounced as a D sound on the end. So that's telling us that that child is hearing that. Their phonemic awareness is good. What they haven't been taught is the orthographic convention that when we're talking about the past tense, we write ED. So that's the role of explicit instruction around morphology and syntax, linking that in, of course, to vocabulary and to writing. Yes, we could wait for that child to infer that for him or herself, but wouldn't it be quicker and more efficient just to explicitly teach that? Because that's pretty much a rule that kids can take to the bank. There's a whole lot of regular verbs that take ED on the end. There's a whole lot of irregular verbs as well. But that's quite interesting, valuable diagnostic information about what the child does know, and also about what the child doesn't know about the orthographic convention of how to represent the past tense. So if we take a base word like shape, there are lots of affixes, prefixes and suffixes that we can add to this simple base morpheme shape. We can add an S on the end, which could be either plural or a verb form. We can add an ing, and that has a spelling convention that we're going to drop the E in many cases, not in all cases, which is confusing. We can make it past tense, shaped. We can put some prefixes on the start, reshape. We can, if you look at misshape, knowledge of morphology here helps guard against the child reading this as mishape. So when children understand a little bit about morphology, they're clued in to the fact that MIS at the start of the word may well be a prefix that's changing the meaning of the base word. So if they do initially pronounce it as mishape, then they will hopefully realise that that's not correct, and there's another hypothesis that they need to test. Notice I'm talking about testing hypotheses, not guessing. Reshaping has a prefix and a suffix, as does reshaped. Now, why should we increase the focus on morphology? That's because, as I said, the structure of English is morphophonemic. We don't have a strictly alphabetic language. We're not like Finnish and Italian and Spanish, where it is a strictly alphabetic language where there's strong phoneme-grapheme correspondences. But we also don't have a completely dense orthography. We're somewhere in between, and we do have a rule-governed orthography. It's just, as I said earlier, that there happen to be quite a few rules. Morphology ties to etymology, the study of word origins. This is very beneficial to learning spelling rules. It's beneficial to both typically developing and struggling learners. So it's not something that we save for enrichment for the children who are doing well. It's actually very beneficial to unpack what's going on more explicitly for children who are struggling if we start talking about morphology. And of course it enriches students' knowledge about the English language and the derivations of different words within our language. So if we go back to our diagram thinking about what it means to be a pragmatically competent user of everyday oral language, I'd like to touch for a moment on the importance of discourse skills. And I guess speechies think about some key different kinds of discourse that are important in the school context. Conversation, of course, is the first kind of discourse that begins to emerge. I have a beautiful 6-week-old granddaughter, and already I like to think we're kind of having little conversations because she makes a noise and I go, oh really? And then she makes another noise, and this really is the beginning of dialogue, that there's a little bit of very basic turn taking, and of course as adults we're doing most of the heavy lifting and we're over interpreting everything that babies do, but that's what we do. That's how we engage them in this process of serve and return. This is central to the social fabric. It's central to making and maintaining friendships, so it's very important for mental health. It's very important for following the play in classrooms. And of course, there are a number of culturally determined rules that have to be learnt. And we learn these rules invariably through breaking them and being told that we've said something rude or inappropriate, or we've interrupted, or we changed the topic at the wrong time. That's, just shush, that's not what we're talking about, that's not relevant. It's amazing that any of us reach that point of pragmatic competence in that purple cup, really, because there's so much adult energy and those of you who are parents, we can call this teaching manners, if you like. There's a lot of work that goes into honing the skills of children, and it goes on right through adolescence, and some would say it goes on much longer than that. Then we move into narrative discourse, and this is the ability to share your experiences with another person by telling a story. And I don't mean a story that's a work of fiction. I mean a story about something that's happened to you. If you know someone very well, you bump into them, you might see friends here at this conference who you haven't seen for a while. You've probably got a bit of an ongoing narrative that you share between each other, and you pick up from where you left off. So if you know each other well, you're not saying, well, I've been married to 17 years to Jerry, and whoa, I know that. Why would you be starting with that? You pick up at the appropriate point. You take the listener perspective. You're constantly gauging interest as you're doing in conversation. And in fact, in the context of conversation, narratives are often co-constructed. So they can be a monologue, but they're often co-constructed in the context of conversation. So we've got to be able to take the perspective of the listener, we've got to put things in a logical order, and we've got to be sensitive to listener interest and listener prior knowledge. There's a lot going on here linguistically, cognitively, socially. Narrative discourse is incredibly important for school success and for reading success. Procedural discourse is tends to be a bit more monologic rather than dialogic, and that's explaining how something is done. So when a child's explaining to another child, this is how you play this game. These are the rules. First you do this, then you do that. You don't do that until before you've done this. Explaining how you use a new smartphone. That's procedural discourse. And then there's expository discourse, which is the ability to expound on a topic, develop an argument, present information logically and coherently, and that's very important academically. And I guess I'm using expository discourse now, and that's something that we ask more and more of children as they move through the academic levels of school. Discourse skills are very important for both walls of our house. They're very important for interpersonal verbal success. They're also very important for understanding written text and also producing your own written text, because it's about genre, it's about voice, and it's about purpose and understanding why you would be using different genres in different contexts. James Britton said this back in the 1970s, and I think you all know this, but it's important for us to remind ourselves of the fact that classrooms are highly verbal environments. It's very, very hard to do anything in a classroom without it being transacted verbally. The good news is that to develop children's oral language skills, whether we're talking in the preschool years or the early years of school or even in secondary school, you don't actually need a special program to do that. And as I said yesterday, it's not programs that teach children how to read, teachers teach children how to read, and teachers develop oral language skills as well. You don't need a program. I fully understand the scaffold of a program. I fully understand the idea of training wheels and safety and security, but there's no substitute for your knowledge under the bonnet about how language works, and there's no substitute for intentionality with respect to your own use of language in the classroom. Now I want to shift gear just slightly and go over to the executive function side of our pragmatic language competence cup, because this is very challenging for many children, and I want to talk for a moment about what that means for cognitive load and cognitive load theory and how you can manage cognitive load in the classroom. Now, executive functions refer to higher order cognitive abilities such as attention, concentration, planning, organisation, self-monitoring, impulse control. These are all functions of the prefrontal cortex, these very front parts of the frontal lobes of the brain that develop slowly and late. Neuroscientists thought they were very clever in the last couple of decades to have identified that these functions don't mature until into the early 20s, a little bit older for males than for females. I think if they'd gone and talked to any parents of adolescents, they could have found out the same information without all those expensive functional fMRI studies, or fMRI studies. However, we know that they're late, that they're slow to develop and they're late to develop. So we can ask very little of a toddler when it comes to executive functioning. Over time, we ask more and more of children, but we're providing lots of scaffolding and support and repeated opportunities for mastery, because these skills are under construction until well into the early to mid-20s. So we need to keep that in mind. They're still under construction even for young people who've left school and potentially moved on to higher education. And I can attest to this as someone who works in a university. They all relate directly to information processing, the ability to take in new information from the outside world. And what is school if not about taking in new information? They all impact on working memory, and one of the problems with working memory is that working memory is not a muscle. The brain is not a muscle. Don't let anyone tell you that the brain's a muscle like other parts of the body and we just exercise it to make it better. That's a whole lot of woo. There is no evidence that anything that works directly on working memory, such as programs like CogMed or neurofeedback, actually improve working memory. We've got to work with working memory, not on working memory. That's a very important concept. And of course, the ability to shift new information from short-term memory into long-term memory is what constitutes learning, but we've got to deal with the limits of the information processing system in order to do that. So information comes in from the outside world, and a lot of information hits our senses at a low level. Did someone hear something clang a moment out there? But you weren't distracted by it. You weren't all swinging around and being off your game. You processed that at a very low sensory level and kept your focus on what I'm talking about, which is very flattering. Thank you. If I hadn't brought that up, you would have forgotten that. That would not have stayed in your conscious awareness, the fact that there was a clanging sound a moment ago. If we're more purposeful about incoming information, it makes its way into working memory. Who's ever had to log into a computer system that needs a username and a password, but something's happened and you have to have an SMS message to get a new code that you have to put in? So you're holding in place your password, but then you've also got to temporarily hang on to a meaningless 6-digit code that is going to have no meaning for you in 5 seconds' time once you've entered it. That's working memory. It's different from short-term memory where things just there for a short period of time. Working memory, you're doing something with it, hence the word working. You're actually having to manipulate things simultaneously. If you're in a shop and you see that something is 30% off, now let's say that the base price is $45 and it's 30% off. Now you've probably got a more clever way of doing this, but what my old brain would do is say, okay, 10% of 45 is $4.50 and I'll multiply that by 3. Now you see how I'm having to use working memory because I've got to hold in mind what the original price was, 45. Now I'm going to have to multiply 4.5 by 3. And then I'm going to have to deduct that from the original price. So that's a working memory task. I'm holding a couple of pieces of information in mind and manipulating them. When we get information into long-term memory in theory has a limitless capacity. Isn't that a nice idea? Limitless capacity. We could all learn every language on the planet as long as we did enough practice and consolidation. But this is what learning is. And isn't this the purpose of, one of the purposes of going to school, getting stuff into long-term memory? Working memory requires rehearsal, and it's a bit like, it's got the capacity of a mental post-it note, effectively. So not a lot of information can sit in working memory, but we're going to work with it. We're going to do something with it in order to get something into long-term memory. Cognitive load theory was developed by John Sweller and his colleagues at the University of New South Wales, and basically that considers the limits on human information processing, especially the constraints imposed by working memory alongside task design and delivery to maximise learning, transfer to long-term memory. Long-term memory, as I said, has no limits, but it's hard to get information into that particular storage system. And Sweller invited us to think about intrinsic load, so the complexity of the material itself, and the extraneous load, which is factors that complicate learning and can be controlled by teachers through good educational design and delivery. So what do I think teachers need to do or can do to manage cognitive load? Firstly, be knowledgeable about information processing and its constraints and the limits on working memory. Think about the physical environment. I go into quite a few foundation year classrooms, reception classrooms, and I'm always struck by the level of noise. And those of you who are early years teachers, you might habituate to it, but remember, you're experts, you're not novices. Think about the last time you were in the car and you were lost and you had to, it used to be a street directory we got out, but you had to get your phone out to check Google Maps. I was conscious of myself doing this the other day. The first thing I did was turn off the radio. Too much cognitive load. Too much extra stuff going into my brain. I needed to focus. I think early years classrooms are way too noisy for many little fragile learners with fragile information processing systems. If you've got money left over in your budget, get your principal to spend it on soundproofing as a start so that you're not being distracted by what's happening in the classroom next door. Seating configuration. Sometimes having children facing each other is not cognitively the most efficient and effective way of getting them to learn new information. Visual distractions. Classrooms are very visually interesting and busy, but sometimes we could afford to lower the level of visual distractions. Task analysis. What am I asking of this child or these children? How many steps does it involve? What am I assuming in terms of prior knowledge? How do I need to break the task down into simpler elements? Are there some parts that I need to provide some worked examples for? And maths is a great example of situations where you would do worked examples. So task analysis articulates with careful task design. Using explicit instruction for initial exposure. That's just an efficiency measure. Don't leave it to guesswork and to chance that children know what you're talking about. Don't let them have to discover everything. There's not enough time for them to discover everything. Explicit instruction followed by worked examples. Use project and discovery learning after the basic mastery component and making appropriate adjustments for students with disabilities and avoiding quick fixes approaches to working memory because there are none. We work with working memory, not on working memory. Now, there's a wonderful publication produced by the New South Wales Centre for Evaluation and Statistics in Education. They really need to get their marketing people onto their name. And it is for teachers, cognitive load theory, research that teachers really need to understand. And you can download that document from their website. Can I just quickly do a bit of myth busting? These are some common things that have kind of got into the education water that are hard to get out of the education water. Meaning comes first when teaching children how to read. That's like saying Mozart comes first when you're teaching children how to play the piano. When we're teaching children how to play the piano, we teach them basic concepts of correspondence between the keys on the piano and notation on the page. We don't say, here's a Mozart sonata, bang around for a bit and it'll eventually start sounding like Mozart, because it probably won't. If parents read to their children more, literacy problems would drop dramatically. English is too irregular a language for phonics instruction to be beneficial. I think we've dealt with that one. As long as phonics is in the mix, children will learn to decode. Some children will, but there's probably 30 to 40% who won't. Children should only be exposed to authentic texts. Children need lots of exposure to beautiful, authentic children's literature, but let's not conflate books that we read to children with books that we want children to read when they're in the early stages of learning how to read. Decodable texts kill children's love of reading. Not being able to read kills children's love of reading. Systematic phonics instruction excludes vocabulary and other aspects of language development. That's simply wrong. Classroom seating configuration should be the same for all kinds of tasks. I think once you read about cognitive load theory, you'll rethink that. Discovery learning is more enjoyable for children than explicit instruction. Explicit instruction can be extremely and should be extremely enjoyable. Discovery learning can be very frustrating for some children if they don't understand basic principles. Explicit instruction means no opportunities for discovery learning. It doesn't. It's what's used for initial exposure. Phonics can only be taught properly using a commercial program. We've already dealt with that. Knowledgeable teachers do a great job of teaching phonics. And there are quick fixes that involve computers and parents spending lots of money. What I'm going to invite you to think about is and we won't have time to talk about this, but if I was to ask you on a scale of 1 to 10 how much the application of scientific evidence matters in these fields, I'm pretty sure you'd say 10. And yet in education, it's been a bit of a case of choosing your own adventure, letting teachers do their own thing. And I think professionalism and professional autonomy is really just another way of saying a highly constrained form of community accountability, because all of these people, the doctors, the pilots, the engineers, they are professionals and they display that professionalism through their highly constrained accountability to the communities that they serve by applying good science. And that's what we need to do in education as well. Why is teaching reading like launching a rocket? It's like launching a rocket, not just because it's an amazing thing to go into outer space, but because if we're millimetres out on the launching pad, we'll be miles out in space. So, thank you.